The Boy Who Changed His World, written by Robert Whanslaw, narrated by Christopher Lloyd Owen. Chapter 2, 1978. Callum sat on his black plastic-cushioned, silver-framed chair at his white formica-top desk and stared at the yellow concentric circles trapping themselves on the red wallpaper in front of him. Or perhaps it was a castle's fortress offering protection. He wanted to lose himself within those confines of safety. His mind wandered, and outside the gentle hum of a petrol lawnmower played an ominous melody as he tried to study. With fewer than 24 hours to go, time exponentially increased its pace as every day passed since the requirement to read aloud and present their written homework to the class was announced. It approached, now racing towards him like a juggernaut, out of control, ready to smash its victim to pulp. At that moment he felt like mush. Legs weak, arms all pins and needles, and nausea erupting from within. To stop time now was a gift Callum wanted more than anything. Tomorrow he would stand up in front of the class and read his essay on Richard the Lionheart. The King of England showed no fear when he led the Christian Crusaders into battle against one of the most formidable leaders and warriors the world had known, Saladin of the Muslims. The night before the Battle of Arsuf, was Richard shaking? Was he struggling to find his words? Callum doubted it very much, wishing he could be like King Richard, brave, strong, and admired. He would have had to have done something of noteworthiness to deserve such accolade. That was where he fell short, he had no doubt. He had been told and reminded of his inadequacies on many occasions, the imprint now carved deeply and etched within, impossible to forget. History was a favourite lesson of Callum's, along with maths, English, geography and physics. Physics not quite so much, but he still expected a high grade. This put him in the top group at school. Being in the top group was easy when you worked as hard as he did. There was little else for him to do. He had no friends, no real friends he could call upon if needed. There was, of course, Stephen Watts. Was he a friend? Stephen held the record for the thickest lens glasses in the whole school. They often sat together by default in physics and maths because nobody else wanted to sit next to them. Stephen didn't do the other subjects Callum did. In those classes he sat by himself. They didn't speak much, apart from on topic areas they studied that week. After class they would walk out into the playground together, stand there for 5 minutes without saying much, and then Callum would take out his magazine and read until the bell rang for the next lesson. It wasn't that Callum didn't try to make conversation. He did. He would say things like, "Did you watch Happy Days Saturday?" Or, "How about Starsky and Hutch?" The answer would always be, "No." Friends. Perhaps not the correct word, Callum thought on reflection. It used to be different, but now he struggled to know where he belonged, accepting his shyness and insecurities and keeping himself to himself as much as possible. Outside there was the clanking of metal. Callum got up from his desk, sat sideways to the window, unable to concentrate, and looked to the houses opposite. Across the road he saw an old man with wild, wired silver hair tending to Mrs. Wicks's garden, as he did each week. The clanking noise was his spade, followed by the fork thrown in the back of his rusty worn jeep that had seen better days. Callum watched as he pushed the palms of his hand into his back and stretched and contorted his face to release the aching of his muscles. After stretching and twisting, he recoiled to his normal stooped posture. The old man stomped back to Mrs. Wicks's front garden from the jeep with his head hung low. His stoop hid his height, which Callum estimated to be nearly 6.5 feet. He was tall and strong, like a boxer with muscles bursting from his arms. Callum wished he had arms like that. He looked at his own stick-like puny body. The man slapped off the motorized lawnmower with his gloved right hand, killing the music to make way to the familiar shouts of misery and anger from the floor below. Again. Callum wished the old man would start it up again to drown it out. He was there every Wednesday when Callum returned home from school, and at this time, every Wednesday at 6 o'clock, he would pack up. Callum had taken little notice of the old man before, but welcomed the distraction, diverting his mind from tomorrow. He watched him kneel before the flower beds as if in prayer. Mrs. Wicks's garden outshone all the others on the road, full of colour, yellow and pink chrysanthemums 3 feet high, and red, white and pink roses stood valiantly, guarding the front lawn and warning off predators. The cul-de-sac had 15 houses, all detached and all with pleasant and cared-for gardens, except number 12. He looked down and compared the long grass that hadn't seen a blade for 2 months. And that was when Jim, his stepfather, in his typical Sunday afternoon inebriated state, decided Callum was a lazy git who did nothing and should cut the grass. A brand new blue S registration Cortina Mark IV Ghia glistened with pride, pulled into number 6 next door to Mrs. Wicks's house. The back door flung open, and Darren Vaughan climbed out of it with a satchel slung over his shoulder. Back from St. Nicholas, private school education, brand new car, and a holiday in Majorca last year. The unfairness of it vexed Callum. He envied his life, and wished he too could also have some of it. Callum and Darren used to be friends when he was younger and went to the same primary school. After school they'd cycle up and down the road and race, playing football or tennis. Darren would win every time. In the summer they would swim in Darren's back garden. He had an outdoor swimming pool with water cold as ice, but that didn't stop the excitement. Nobody else had a swimming pool in their back garden that Callum knew. Indoors they'd play board games like Monopoly, Cluedo, and football Subbuteo, but Darren was never allowed around Callum's house. My mum says I'm not allowed around other people's houses. That's what he would say, but Callum knew the word other meant specifically his house. Word spread since Jim moved in. It was the looks at first, and then the whispers, and then the words spoken aloud, spoken without care. At first, when Callum was younger, he didn't pick up on the signals, but now, at the age of 15, he saw it all. That's the drug dealer's boy. Old tart, our old man was hardly cold when he moved in. You want to keep away from them sort. None of them true, or so Callum chose to believe, but it made him stoop as he walked, head to the ground, keeping himself to himself, hoping that no one would notice him. He wondered if the old man, who he looked back towards, was also hoping nobody noticed him. Callum focused on the old man, who loaded his lawnmower onto the back of his jeep, removed his gloves, looked up to the sky, and wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm. The bright sun forced the old man to squint and look up towards the window where Callum stood. A feeling of guilt, as if he had been caught doing something he shouldn't, forced him to quickly hide at the side of the window, out of sight. Slowly he leaned his head back to view out of the window. A puff of smoke blasted out of the exhaust, hung in the air as if it had arrived in a place it liked and did not want to leave, but then disappeared as quickly as the jeep drove off. "I'm going out if you can't be bothered to cook like a proper woman. Clear off then, see if I care." With the windows open, the sound carried from downstairs to his bedroom and down the street. The old man had diverted Callum's attention. The hum of the lawnmower had masked the argument between Jim and Rachel, his mum. It was a technique he had developed over the years to block it out. No need to put his hands over his ears. Instead, he pulled his shoulders in tight, tensed all the muscles in his body, and squeezed his eyelids closed, and his eardrums would automatically close, shutting out the sound and sight of the world he didn't want to hear. Rachel stood, arms crossed with her back to the television. She eyed the porcelain figurine of a mother holding a baby on the mantelpiece to her side. The thought of throwing it at him tempted her, but she controlled herself, knowing she would later feel regret from losing a memory of better times. Standing in the doorway of the lounge, Jim glared back at her. In the midst of rage and argument, Rachel tried to remain calm and process the situation through her head to find an answer, but she found none. A strong element of disbelief repeatedly reminded her she'd fallen into the hamster wheel again. "Go on then, clear off, just wish you'd never come back." Any excuse for a game of cards or to get out of the house, and he would take it. In truth, Jim didn't need a reason. A moment's silence filled the lounge, occupied only by the background noise of the television, with Sue Lawley speaking of some impending disaster in Central Africa. Rachel's eyes, loaded with daggers, penetrated Jim's. He spat out a choked laugh, left the lounge for the hall, where the upright coat stand offered his brown leather jacket that he swiped without thanks and threw over his shoulder. A quick, sharp shock jolted through her body, unsure if it was from the noise of the door slamming or the fear the frosted glass panels that covered the mass of the area would shatter into a quintillion pieces. She moved into the hall to watch through the frosted glass his kaleidoscopic body move up the path and climb into his white van. Engine started, revved with fury, and he was gone. Sue Lawley continued to depress. Rothmans of Pall Mall offered instant relief, dropping the new packet of 20, less one, onto the kitchen countertop. Her latest New Year's resolution had been to cut back to no more than 10 a day. September, and she was on her second pack already, and it was just past 6. No chance. Always next year. Frantically, she drew on the cigarette, and with each puff she slowed and eased her juddering hand, stabbed it and grinded it into the ashtray, like letting out the final bit of air from a tyre before all her anger was released. She took another. Now she could enjoy it, perching herself up onto the kitchen stool. Clawing through the back of her dark, black, unkempt hair, aged 38, grateful for no grey, although she didn't know how. Smoke hung in the kitchen and dining area. Rachel sat and looked at the table, chairs, and drinks cabinet, all 6 years old or more. When they first moved into Grattan Drive, it was all new. The house and furniture gleamed with hope, as did her dreams for the future. Now it all looked old and tatty, living together for 1 year and married for 4. Apart from the early days, and since they married, they had argued through most of it, and more as each day passed, the intensity of the arguments increased. It was different when she was with Michael. They had money, but it wasn't the money alone that caused the problems. Maybe it had been too soon to remarry, but Jim was kind, and at the time she desperately needed comforting, someone to talk to who would hold her and listen. Callum was too young to understand, and she had to be there for him, and having a father-like figure around, she thought, was the right thing to do. Jim had been a regular at the Pearsons' Arms, where Rachel worked. The pub at the end of the high street, perched on the seafront, breathed in cool, salty air from the waves that brought in only hope and happiness at the time. It had been a part-time job, something to get her out of the house, as Michael worked so hard building up his business. They didn't need the money. It was the social side she liked. Jim would come in and have a couple of pints of Guinness on the nights Rachel worked, Tuesday and Wednesday, and they would chat between her serving other customers. They had met before. Jim had done a lot of work for Michael on the houses they were building. He had a good reputation for being one of the best plasterers in the area, and Michael only wanted to work with quality tradesmen. Michael held a party and had out the function rooms at the Royal on the seafront in Tankerton. It proved a double celebration, Michael's 30th birthday and England, Michael's adopted country, winning the World Cup final the Saturday before, which gave the party an extra special edge. Life could not have been better. They hired a band, and beer and wine flowed heavily. She couldn't remember how, but ended up dancing with Jim. Michael, not usually a big drinker, was drunk and oblivious to everything around him for one of the few times in his life, but she liked the attention, sucking it up in vats. After that, they always spoke when he came into the pub. Rachel was unsure if she imagined it, but thought he had become a more frequent customer since the party, and she still held a little guilt. They got to know each other better after Michael's car crash. Jim would drive Callum to places, clubs, and sometimes school when he was going to be late. Jim would pick him up. It was just what Rachel needed, time to do nothing. The world had fallen in on her. From having everything, she had nothing. With Michael, she had so much. Business was thriving, and that was how they bought the house in Grattan Drive. Chesterfield, they had dreamed of living there, but never thought, in reality, they could afford a place in one of the most affluent areas of Whitstable. Michael raised a colossal deposit to secure the mortgage, and even with the repayments, they had a comfortable cash sum left over each month. Michael was good with money and an excellent businessman. They were going places. 10 years, 15 max, Rach, and they would have had the mortgage paid off, he told her often, with that big smile. That smile Callum inherited and reminded her of Michael every time. It was paid off in 5 years, with the life insurance. Life alone, living with only ghosts, she couldn't handle. People could talk and look down on her. Let them. It was her life. What had it to do with them? What right had they to judge? And of course there was Callum. Surely it was better to have a man around the house, a mentor, someone to look up to, would be better for his upbringing. It all made sense. It felt natural, almost destined. So Jim moved in. It was a year since Michael's accident, or 11 months to be exact, which in her mind was as good as a year. At first, life smiled. To make love again, or was it just sex, she could never be sure, but it was good. Occasional twinges of guilt quivered, knowing it was better than with Michael. Michael focused on work, and the bedroom was where he slept. Being held by Jim in his arms gifted security, and sex was the confirmation. During the night she would wrap her arms around Jim's stomach as he slept, watching him breathe gently. Wedding vows were the switch, turning him into another man. Before the confetti touched the ground, things changed. She sucked on the Rothmans to the filter and slowly extinguished the embers in the ashtray. Jim had convinced Rachel to give up working at the Pearsons. It would be good for her, give her time to recover and take life easy. But as the months passed, they spent less time together. Jim out with friends and Rachel stuck at home. Recession hit hard in 73. Work dried up, Jim's income dropped, and it was now their only income, which brought on financial pressures and arguments grew more venomous each time. Vodka became her friend. Each year it got worse, from knight to monster. Everything had changed. Callum paced his bedroom. His palms sweated. He had to focus, or tomorrow would be a disaster. A disaster, it was inevitable, and he already secretly knew and wondered why he was trying to kid himself. Holding his open exercise book, he closed his eyes. The harder he tried, the harder it was to recall the words. If only he could learn it by heart, but his mind went blank, shutting off in a panic. He sneaked a glimpse at the words. Richard I, King of England, reigned from 1189. Closed the book and tried to remember how long he reigned. It had gone. It was not that he did not know, but a door slammed shut and locked itself tight, blocking the information. Influenza was what he wanted, to be hit by a car, or best of all, struck down by lightning. Anything to get him out of school tomorrow.